Hello, this is Matt Burns, the University of Missouri again, and we're talking about cross-cultural competence and academic interventions. So far, we've given an overview, and we talked about how in order to be competent culturally, you have to have knowledge of other cultures, a personal awareness of your own implicit biases and your own culture, and you have to be able to apply that knowledge. The next step in this conversation, we talk about how to apply those into a three-tiered intervention model for academic difficulties. Of course, if we talk about three-tiered models, we always have to start with tier one. In tier one, much of this is I'm going to base on research and work by Klinger and Edwards from 2006. They reviewed the literature, Klinger and Edwards, and wanted to see what are effective practices for diverse students, for students from backgrounds who aren't the same as the dominant culture. And they said that there were some students who were academically successful from diverse backgrounds. And those who were all had a high quality curriculum, effective instruction, and frequent interaction with teachers on an individual basis. In other words, good core instruction. Amanda Vanderheide and I, a few years ago, wrote a chapter in the Multicultural Handbook for School Psychology, and ours was on academic interventions. And our conclusion was, when we look at all the literature, that much of what we talk about in terms of academic interventions from a diversity perspective were really just those stereotypes and those learning styles, cultural learning styles that we already talked about that were problematic. And really your best bet is to really focus on good instruction, good instructional practices, intervention practices. Research by several have shown that when you use good, effective practices implemented in districts with kids from diverse backgrounds, such as urban schools, etc., results were consistent with the data from schools with mostly middle-class white kids. So the result, step one, good instructional practice, good core instruction. But there's a couple other things to consider as well. So cooperative learning. Much of the research done around cooperative learning was from the 80s and 90s. And we haven't seen much lately, but there's been quite a bit around it. And they showed that positive cultural relationships were linked to intergroup cooperation. If we had cooperative learning groups that had different cultural backgrounds represented in them, we tended to see good intergroup cooperation. And groups with more than 50% minority ethnicity were more effective than those with less than 50%. And stronger effects were found for schools in urban settings. So if you're working in a school with a large, diverse background student population, I really encourage you to take a look at cooperative learning. It's not difficult to implement. To really talk about what it is and how to do it goes beyond the scope of today's conversation, but good core instruction with infused cooperative learning activities. I would also argue for engaging families. Much of this work is from Sam Ortiz, as I mentioned earlier. Sam Ortiz, Sharon Vaughn, Janine Jones, people like that do work in this area. And they found that many people, white people especially, who are teachers, etc., say that families of minority background students are disinterested in education. It can't be further from the truth. Ortiz and Flanagan talked about how professionals within the school, that parents of families from culturally diverse students, have tremendous respect for professionals within the school. And other studies have shown that cultural groups historically value and support education, have extended family support for raising and educating their children, make personal sacrifices to assure that children could have an education, and differences within the ethnic groups were greater than differences between them, which is often the case in almost any variable we talk about. And now a quick personal take on this. And I've worked in schools, dozens and dozens of schools. And one time was a man from Cambodia, and his family escaped Cambodia under the communist regime when he was 13. And they snuck out in the middle of the night. And during that escape, they were shot at by the military, and he was wounded. He was hit in the shoulder. And it wasn't a serious wound, but still, he was wounded escaping in the middle of the night as a 13-year-old child. And then when he came here, he somehow thought that the harder you worked and the more you educated you were, the more successful you could be. In his opinion, education was the key to being successful. So this poor guy, boy, he worked literally two full-time jobs. He worked two full-time jobs and a third job on the weekends. He worked so much. He did that so his wife could stay home with the kids and be heavily invested in their education. In the every day, Saturday, Sunday, and on every day during the summer, their children would do 1 or 2 hours of schoolwork every day. If there was nothing assigned, they would just make up stuff for them to do. They really believed in education. Now, the wife who stayed home didn't speak English very well. And so she would go to school events, but she wouldn't say much. She didn't really get much out of it. She wouldn't always go. And I'm quite certain the staff thought they were disinterested in education. But in reality, these two were passionate about education and made such strong sacrifices to make that happen. So to say that those two are disinterested in education is so unfair and couldn't be further from the truth. So if you're working with a diverse population, yes, absolutely good co-instruction. Let's be sure to use cooperative learning, and let's be engaging in families as much as we can. And third point talks about language proficiency. So we know this now, the language proficiency theory, basic interpersonal communication skills can happen after 2 years, but then it takes cognitive academic language proficiency probably at least 5 years. So we might have a child move here from a different country, not speak a word of English, and in 2 years develop pretty good interpersonal communication skills and be able to talk to you, and they seem like their English is just fine. But they may not be able to participate in core instruction the way we need them to for about another maybe 3 to 4 more years, because they just haven't learned the academic language side of it yet. So don't be misled by the student who seems to have really good English, because it might in fact actually have not developed cognitive language proficiency yet. So what do we do? Well, vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. Great study. Came out in Reading Research Quarterly in 2010. I'm not sure how to say his name, Lassell et al. 2010. They did an 8-day cycle, 45 minutes a day of vocabulary instruction. Now, this was middle school students. Now, 45 minutes might seem like a lot, but I would argue that that's exactly the type of instruction these kids need. First of all, this is middle school. So 45 minutes of vocabulary comprehension instruction a day is a good thing. But secondly, added that these kids have such severe needs did have such strong needs in this area, that seems like a really good use of time. In fact, in the article, they go as far as to talk about that they questioned the staff about this. Is this okay? And the staff all agreed, yes, 45 minutes a day seems optimal and acceptable for children who are struggling with English language. What they did is I won't go into the whole detail. It's a great article. You've got the citations right there. They have a list of what they did, and they actually have an appendix with like lesson plan. It's really, really well done. But in essence, they got something for passages or articles from Time for Kids, the Time magazine for kids, and they would read it, and they would work on academic words that appeared in the text. The Coxhead 2000 has this list of academic words. Words that, again, a kid who speaks after 2 years speaks pretty good conversational language may not know these words. So they said those words that appear in text, because sometimes those words can be quite technical, but if they're in this text, then they're worth learning. And they learned them through a series of different approaches. And what they found was doing so, in pre-test, the control group was actually higher than the treatment group. In post-test, the treatment group did much better for a moderate effect for target word mastery. For morphological decomposition, looking at the word and figuring it out, about the same in pre-test. In post-test, the treatment group did better, about a small effect, 0.22. And the other one was word meaning and context, again, 0.2. There was no pre-test. We saw a 0.2 standard deviation unit difference in post-test in that. And we also saw other gains as well, but they weren't significant and the effects were small and even actually not negligible. But if you look at increasing target word reading mastery, morphological decomposition, even getting meaning from reading words in text, they seem to have a pretty good effect. So tier 1, good core instruction, effective practices, good core instruction, cooperative learning, engaging families, lots of vocabulary instruction for kids, not only for English language learners, but for children from other types of backgrounds as well. The next one then is tier 2. What makes a good tier 2 intervention for kids from diverse backgrounds, especially EL? And I will freely admit that I tend to focus on EL in this conversation, but much of what I'm talking about applies as well to other groups as well. So couple things to keep in mind for Tier 2 interventions. Remember, phonemic awareness transfers from the native language to English. So if the child doesn't demonstrate phonemic awareness in their native language, test it in English. If they demonstrate phonemic awareness in English, then they've demonstrated that they have it, if they demonstrate it in their native language, then they have it in English as well. So if you're worried about phonemic awareness, assess it. The other point I'll make is, we did a study on this looking at what predicts future reading growth among urban and ELL populations. And we saw that rhyming of all the phonemic awareness areas did not predict very well at all. Blending did, segmenting did, manipulating did not. Manipulating did. Blending did, segmenting did, manipulating did, rhyming did not. So if you're working with a kid who's an English learner, or even a kid from a high poverty area, like a inner city school, a really rural school, and they're struggling to learn rhyming, I would try and teach it, but then I would move on pretty quickly and go to blending and segmenting and manipulating. And I'll bet they'll learn those just fine. And if they do, then move on. Don't hold back instruction to teach the kids rhyming. Absolutely try and teach rhyming, but if they're struggling to learn it, move on. And then we differentiate phonics versus fluency, etc. So if a child is a struggling reader and they're an English learner or a kid from a culture that's the minority from the dominant culture, we give them the intervention that the data suggests they get. So if they need a decoding intervention, they get an intervention that focuses on decoding. If they need a fluency intervention, they get an intervention that focuses on fluency, like repeated reading. But in that intervention, we will always, always, always add a vocabulary component. And there's lots of ways to do it. Sam Ortiz talks about previewing the native language. Look at what you're going to do and just talk to them about it in their native language. Give them some idea of what the passage is about, what they're going to read, etc. Give the kid a graphic organizer, something that makes the story that they're about to read or whatever text they're about to read graphic and visual. You can front load by teaching the basic ideas and concepts and use real life props and hands-on activities. For example, if I'm going to do a decoding intervention, I'm going to teach a kid the CH sound. I might look at a picture. I'll give the kid a couple pictures and I say, today we're going to work on things that say ch. And this CH here says ch. And I'll show them a picture of cheese and say, here's a picture of cheese. This is cheese. Cheese starts with ch. Now here's a picture of a chair. Chair starts with ch. That's a chair. I might do 3 or 4 of those and then start the decoding intervention. If I'm doing fluency, like repeated reading, I might go through and find some of the major concepts, show them a picture of it before I start repeated reading at all, so they know what some of the major concepts and pre-teach some of them with pictures. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I want to show you a book, and I'm going to reshare. This is a book by Sylvia Lennon Thompson and Sharon Vaughn, and I highly recommend it. I don't recommend books very often, but this one's really good. So this one's research-based methods of reading instruction for English language learners grades K through 4. And it really should be called research-based methods of reading intervention because it's full of great ideas of ways to infuse vocabulary into different reading interventions. So if you're working with kids who are English language learners, this is something I'd really recommend. It's cheap, but it's easy. If I recommend it, it has to be cheap and easy. So you go to Amazon, get it for about 20 bucks, and it's a great way to infuse vocabulary into reading interventions. Okay, now let's go back to the PowerPoint and reshare it. Okay. All right, so here's a study by Healy and Vanderwood in 2005, and I want to point out a couple things here. So this is a group of kids, and these kids were they were English learners, and they struggled with reading fluency. Now they had good decoding, but they struggled with reading fluency. So for these kids, they got listening passage preview, which is a fluency-based modeling intervention. In addition, they reviewed key words from the passage before beginning, infusing vocabulary as I just talked about. And you can see that 4 of the kids did really well, actually quite well. One did okay, went from in school days, so just 3 weeks, basically, almost 4 weeks. They went from roughly looks like 7 to about maybe, no, that's not 7, that's 3, sorry, to about 9. So they're, going up by about a word per minute per week, which is not great. We want to see more growth than that, but certainly not horrible. But the kids did really well, except this Renee, who probably needed tier 3 intervention. So anytime you have a small group of 4 out of 4, 5 kids, you're doing a small group reading intervention, and 4 do quite well, and 1 needs tier 3. That's not unusual. That's kind of a fairly typical approach, and we'd be pretty happy with these results. But one more thing they showed. Now those were 5 kids. There were 15 kids total getting intervention. Here's all those 15 kids, and they got a language score. And the language score was intermediate. It goes beginning, early intermediate, and then proficient, or whatever the final word is. And so this is their English language proficiency. They also had phoneme segmentation fluency scores for each kid, and baseline and final, baseline nonsense word fluency and finals. This is a measure of phonemic awareness. This is a measure of decoding. Was the intervention successful? Did they reach their goal? And how long did it take? How many sessions? So it took 12 to 25 sessions. And then lastly, there were 3 kids who didn't get exited. If we look at this, we can see that a lot of the kids that did well had low scores here, made nice big gains. These kids here that didn't do well, or well enough, I should say, had low scores, but more importantly, look at their language score, intermediate. They were some of the higher language scores, and some of the kids at the beginning made huge jumps, but took quite a while because he started off pretty low. But early intermediate, these kids all did, with lower language scores, actually did quite well. There's really no relationship between English language test scores and success of reading interventions. It's a myth to think that you have to wait to reach English proficiency. When we were developing the PRESS project, the Path to Reading Excellence in School Sites, we were piloting it in a couple of schools. One of the schools we worked in had a high ELL population. And they said to us, we wanted to work with the kids, and they said, no, you're not allowed to work with these kids for whom English isn't their native language until they demonstrate some level of English proficiency. Now, there was a particular test they used, we'll talk about in just a few minutes, which was shocking to us because several studies have shown that that's a myth. Oral language proficiency in English are poor predictors of reading performance. You don't need to wait. Start reading interventions right away. Sure, infuse vocabulary, you have to make modifications, but begin reading interventions right away. So one of the initial studies on this, Giva and Wade Woolley in '98, said, again, no reason to wait until they have good oral proficiency in English before teaching reading, and no reason to wait before English proficiency to screen kids for reading problems. Russell Gersten has written about that and done a lot of work in it. So as part of the PRESS project, we said, you know what? What happened was there was the school, as I mentioned, and this was a WIDA state. And WIDA has access, which is a measure of language, ACCESS, access. It's a measure of English language. So we wanted to predict, so we monitored progress in other schools that let us work with the kids. And we looked at the correlation, the relationship between weekly growth on CBMR and different variables. So Fall Map, which is the Measures of Academic Progress, it's a great screener published by Northwest Evaluation Association, NWEA, common screener used. Those of you in Missouri, it's not the Missouri State Test, it's a commonly used reading screener. And that in the fall predicted during tier 2 intervention for reading among kids who ELL, it got 5% of the variance of their growth. So how much they grew was related to, small to moderate amount to their fall MAP score. Their fall CBM score, CBMR, of course, also was related and got another 5% of the variance. So almost 11% of the variance, so moderate to almost large amount of the variance was explained in growth, large amount of variance, almost a large amount of variance in growth of how much the kids grew on CBMR during the reading intervention, kids who ELL, was accounted for by this fall MAP and fall CBM. Percent of days present, negligible variance. Language score without reading, negligible variance. Now, most language scores have a reading component to it, and then it correlates well with measures of reading. Yeah, but that's 2 measures of reading. You take out that measure of reading and you just have listening, speaking, etc. Then the relationship goes down to negligible, as we saw here. There was no reason in this example to wait. In fact, we decided to look at the data a little more in depth. And Access has a score of 1 to 6, higher the more proficiency. So we said 1 to 2 was low proficiency, 3 to 4 was medium proficiency, and 5 to 6 was high proficiency. This is the average rate of growth per minute per week, words per minute per week for the kids who are English learners. And you see it was actually the kids in the low group that grew the most. Waiting for a kid to reach English proficiency is a myth. Start right away. This is replicated a number of times. In scientific studies of reading, remedial special ed, other places. I mean, this has been numerously found that you should not wait to start reading interventions for kids who are English learners. The goal here is to integrate new knowledge with prior knowledge, integrate teaching of word meanings with the content and context of the story. But don't rely on vocabulary words. So for example, I one time had a student teach a group of kids the word communism. We pre-taught, these were not English language learners, these were kids in a city school from a high poverty background and an alternative high school. So we had her pre-teach a bunch of words for social studies. So she pre-taught the word communism, and the kids learned it. Then they went to go read it, and they couldn't read the word government. If you can't read the word government, the word communism means nothing. So we stopped, had to go back and reteach these words. So make sure you're reteaching words that are important to the meaning of the text, pre-teaching words important to the meaning of the text, and that are high frequency, those two things. So tier 2, we're going to do good targeted intervention, decoding if they need decoding, fluency if they need fluency, etc. But we'll always infuse a vocabulary component in it that focuses on keywords. Now, tier 3, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on tier 3. Just going to make a couple quick points. Really, to have effective tier 3 approaches among diverse populations, you got to take an ecobehavioral approach, which means idiographic intervention focused data collection, data that focuses on the individual and their particular environment, their experience, their instruction, their whatever, that particular kid. And always with the intention of delivering intervention. That's why we collect the data. We evaluate the data based on growth to the student, him or herself, rather than to norms. So I want to see the kid was, made growth, and we can evaluate the level of that growth rather than say, well, the kid was at the 2nd percentile, now he's at the 3rd or 5th or 6th or whatever. And remember, Office of Civil Rights concluded that response to intervention is more culturally sensitive and fair than traditional approaches to LD identification or even intervention. Minneapolis Public in the 80s developed their RTI, their problem-solving model. The reason they did so was because OCR came in and said they have a disproportionate representation of minority students in special ed. Their response, all right, let's implement, they didn't call it RTI, but let's implement an RTI model. And we have consistently seen the number of students referred, placed, the number of minority students referred, placed in special ed to go down to be similar levels. We've shown that the folks at Minneapolis, Doug Marston, his group showed that a couple times. One in Learning Disabilities Research and Practice. Amanda Vanderheyden had her 2000 article in Journal of School Psychology that found that. Sylvia Rosenfield and Todd Gravois with their instructional consultation teams also showed more culturally fair assessments as a result of this, in essence, RTI approach. In tier 3, that's when the problem solving team comes in. I would argue tier 2 and tier 1 decisions are made by professional learning communities, grade level teams, department teams like the math team, the ELA team, whatever. But in tier 3 is when the problem solving team comes in. You can't really do good problem solving teams at tier 2. There's just too many students to work with. So tier 3 is the problem solving team comes in. I'd love to spend time talking about how to run a good problem solving team. I can't do that here. All I'm going to say is, from a diversity perspective, the team needs to be diverse. You need to have multiple viewpoints on that team, and you need to have viewpoints that represent the students being discussed, that can talk about their background, talk about their experiences. The team should include a bilingual or English or an ESL specialist if that resource exists in the school, especially if you're talking about students for whom English is not their native language. The team member can offer guidance with culturally sensitive ongoing assessment. I really seriously hope that's the school psychologist. I really hope that's what they bring to the table, that they can talk about what makes a culturally sensitive assessment that you can use on an ongoing basis to determine if the kid's making successful progress or not. Teams should have a wide range of meaningful intervention strategies. I've talked about that, have a series of interventions. I recommend getting the Sylvia and Sharon's book on ways to infuse vocabulary into different interventions. And then observe and interact the student in various settings. Go observe the kid where their environment exists. Get them in different settings. Make sure we can see that this behavior, and I'm not talking about behavior problems, talking about academic behaviors, are problems in various settings and in various environments. And then lastly, I mentioned previously, Janine Jones cites this multicultural interview. Boy, I would argue in a good problem-solving model, if a child from a diverse background, before the team ever meets, we're going to collect baseline data, do some problem analysis, look at, is the kid struggling to learn in the first place, struggling to remember it, or struggling to generalize it? All that's going to happen. Talk to the teacher. We're also going to talk to the student and get a multicultural interview. Let's get a sense of that child's perspective on his or her background. And then lastly, I'll end on this point, which is, remember, the American Psychological Association, the National Association of School Psychologists, the Council for Exceptional Children, all of them have standards and ethical guidelines that point out the importance of cultural competence in working with children. The APA just recently, in 2017, published the guidelines for multicultural practice. They're really good. You can get them for free. Just Google APA Multicultural Guidelines 2017. It's a PDF. They have 10 guidelines. I won't get into them here, but a couple quick points. In 2017, they said it's time for psychologists to reconsider diversity and what counts as multicultural, what constitutes good multicultural practice within professional psychology. And again, their focus was on intersectionality as its primary purview. And they conclude that psychologists need to consider how knowledge and understanding of identity develops from and is disseminated within professional psychological practice. How are we learning about our knowledge and understanding of identity? Psychologists need to acknowledge, address, and embrace developmental and contextual antecedents of identity. And then lastly, one of my favorites that I've said multiple times, psychologists need to acknowledge within group differences and the role of self-definition in identity. Oftentimes, in most variables, most points of interest, within group differences are as great as between group. Cultural competence, multicultural competence, cross-cultural competence is required by ethical guidelines, and it's just good ethical practice that results in the best outcomes for our children.